All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Alyssa Altamirano. On behalf of all of us at the locally based independent bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Harvard Bookstore and Politics and Prose, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Tsering Yangzom Lama to discuss her debut novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, published by our friends at Triumph Books. Tsering Yangzom Lama earned an MFA from Columbia University, where she had held multiple fellowships. She has received grants and residencies from the Canada Council for the Arts, Hedgebrook, Art Omi, Tin House, and the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, among many others. Tsering's family fled Tibet in the early 1960s to Nepal, where she was born and raised. She has since lived in Vancouver, Toronto, and New York City. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Maaza Mengiste, a novelist, essayist, and photographer. She is the author of the novel The Shadow King, which is shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and was a 2020 LA Times Book Prize fiction finalist. It was named the Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, NPR, Elle, Time, and more. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and other publications. Her story, Dust, Ash, Flight, which appeared in Addis Ababa Noir, edited by Maaza, was awarded a 2021 Edgar Award for Best Short Story. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and please order your copy of We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies from Books and Books and support independent bookstores. And now, without further ado, let's welcome our guests to the virtual floor. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Tsering, it is really, really wonderful. Hi, can you hear me? It's wonderful to see you and to talk to you after so many years. Before I jump into questions, why don't you start us off with a reading from your absolutely beautiful book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. Those of you listening, if you haven't purchased it yet, please do so. It's amazing, and we're going to talk more about it. But Tsering, what if you start us off with a reading?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, Maaza. Let me just make sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I'm just going to read from the opening of my book. This is in the border of Western Tibet and Nepal in spring 1960. Amma was an oracle. The realization came to my mother late in life when her monthly bleeding stopped and something else opened inside. Some in our village called it an affliction. They said there was a crack in her mind that left her open to spirits who would consume her. Sorry, I'm getting feedback. I'm just going to take off.
Gosh, okay, is this okay?
I'm not
sure why this is happening. This is so weird. I'm sorry, I don't know why.
Do you have any other windows open?
No, I don't. Let me try.
Yeah, I've turned off. I'll turn off my mic again, but I've had it off. Thank you all for bearing with us. We'll be with you in a minute.
Hello? Okay. All right.
You're muted. Tsering, you're muted. So sorry, you were muted.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I think we should just move into questions because I'm hearing feedback and it's so hard for me to read because I hear
I'm
myself.
So sorry.
Everything.
I can hear. Okay, I think I can hear you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm sorry about the echo. Please just talk over yourself. But I think you were starting off with this first section, and it began with Amma was an oracle. I was going to lead off with another question, but with this reading that you had planned, I wondered if you could talk about this. You center female voices in this book, and particularly a female village oracle. Could you talk about the decisions behind that?
Sure. So as I was writing this book, I was really interested in trying to learn about Tibetan culture and Tibetan heritage. And there are many things that I didn't have access to, living in exile and also never attending Tibetan school. And in the process of researching this book, I learned about the oracular practice in Tibet, which is actually ancient, probably as old as the oracular practice in Greece, ancient Greek. And as I was studying this, I learned that Tibetan women actually have been leaders in this space, especially in central and western Tibet, which is where my family's from. And these women would be chosen by deities in the land and in the mountains, in the rivers, lakes. These gods that predated the arrival of Buddhism 1,200 years ago. And as vessels for these gods, they would advise their villages, they would help them find out what the future held in times of crisis. They would even mediate conflicts. So sometimes these women would have more power than men, like monks and other male leaders, which I found to be deeply moving, to think about this kind of leadership existing for thousands of years, long ago. You know, sometimes we think of like progress being in this linear sense, and we don't actually have enough regard for ancient wisdom and the ways in which women held communities together for thousands of years. And the oracular practice in the Tibetan narrative, in the modern narrative, we often think about it as the Naching oracle, who is the state oracle, who gave the Dalai Lama the path to escape into exile in 1959. And that oracle is a state oracle, like a very important oracle. But village oracles are far away from centers of power. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in ordinary people far away from power, because that's really the community that I'm most familiar with is ordinary Tibetans. And also, I think in terms of a national narrative of the modern Tibetan history, we haven't heard enough about how ordinary people lived and survived in this time. And, you know, Maaza, like your book, Shadow King, which I have right here, you know, there's so many, I mean, something so powerful in the way that you centered women there, and sort of recast this entire historical moment through women at the center. I found that really inspiring, and I think we need more of that.
Oh, Tsering, that's really generous of you. I remember you and I don't even remember how many years ago we met now. you were a student and you were working on this book as your thesis, and I remember the many conversations that we were having about it. There's one moment that just stuck in my mind, and I think we were sitting at a Starbucks, probably I think in the Upper East Side where we would meet, and you had we were just talking about some pages, and you showed me a picture, and I think it was Tibet, and you said it was mountains, it was a mountainside, and you said, how do I describe this? How do I describe this? How do I describe landscape? And I was thinking about your process and the progress from those early days to this book now, which is, I'm going to keep saying it to everyone, but it is an absolutely stunning and beautiful book. And I wondered, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your progress to making this book. I can imagine quite literally it's been a journey. And this is a novel about displacement, about exile. You've experienced some of this, but how did maybe some of the experiences you knew about or things that you had lived become maybe help to inform this book? How did you move from one to the other?
So yeah, that I think might have been like 9 years ago, a long time ago. And the first couple of years when I was starting to write this book, I was really just making my characters do things, just moving them around. I didn't really know what the story was. And I remember, Maaza, you said, you need to just get to the end of a draft because I kept polishing it. And so I took that advice, and then I saw what I had in front of me in terms of just the bones of the story. And then I realized how much more I wanted to enrich it. So describing the landscape, but also understanding this world much deeper. And so I spent a lot of time in the stacks at Columbia, actually, just given that I had access to one of the best libraries in the world for Tibetan texts, Tibetan scholarship. I spent a lot of time reading about the oracular practice, the Terma text tradition, which is a tradition of hidden texts all over Tibet that are both physical and also mind texts, which is a beautiful idea. And Tibetan art, the theft of Tibetan art and how they've ended up in all the museums we see. And I also physically went to the border. I took a trek to Mustang, which is on the border of Tibet and Nepal. And that's the route that many Tibetans took to flee. And so I wanted to experience that landscape and to imagine what it was like. And I got to spend about 15 minutes on the border before my driver said we have to go because there were a huge Chinese encampment. And at the border, I saw all of these little stupas made of ashes. And I saw that people had brought the remains of their loved ones there as a final act. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. And as I studied more about this culture that I had honestly been cut off from because of colonization and exile and never having studied in a Tibetan school, I realized that this was the most important ornamental work I could do. In sense, it created also the structure for the book. I use these traditions and rituals and ideas as narrative structure. Like the nameless saint is a way for me to talk about the Terma tradition, the tradition of teachings that come and go as you need them. And so giving that to an actual physical object was a way for me to utilize these beautiful ideas. So there was a lot of combing over and over, trying to enrich the world. And a lot of that had to do with teaching myself these things first.
It's interesting. I could see in those days when we were talking that you were really trying to get a scope of place and setting and trying to ground your characters' experiences in a very real world. I can't imagine what it must have been like for you to have made it to that border, for just the brief 15 minutes. But I wondered if you could give the audience members a brief description of what the setting, what the book is about, and talk a little bit about these characters that inhabit the book. I mean, there are different voices that come in, and they span generations, and actually countries and years. And could you tell us a bit about them, like Lama and Dolma and so on?
Yeah, so at core, there's a family. And the family is two sisters, Lama and Tenki. They're two little girls. And they escape from Tibet with their parents and uncle. And their parents die pretty early in the book because of the difficulty of the journey over the Himalayas. And they escaped on foot. And they were, starvation and so forth. And then the story basically goes from there. It's this family, these two sisters have very different fates. One is Lama, who's the caretaker, slightly older. And so she's sort of chosen for that role. Like, you're meant to take care of Tenki. And Tenki is seen as the brilliant one, the one that has all the potential. She's the hope of the camp, the refugee camp. And that creates a different set of expectations and sets her up for, I guess, even greater hardship in a sense. And Lama remains in the camp, and Tenki goes to India to pursue higher education and then ends up in Canada. And there's also Samfel, who Lama falls in love with. So there's a couple of love interests. And then there's Dolma, who is Lama's daughter and who also ends up in Toronto. But essentially the book, I guess you could think of it as a fractured family, and it's structured in a way that shows that sort of disorientation as we move from one person's reality to another person's reality, moving from a refugee camp to an art party in Toronto, which I think is reflective of the sense of disorientation, the moral disorientation of exile. That some people could exist in such poverty and others could have such privilege, and yet they're so tethered to each other. And that's really reflected in the story, in the structure itself.
Yeah, you did such a wonderful job of connecting the threads between these characters, letting us know that even with the distances between them, they're not really that far apart. Lama was, for me, felt like such an important character. If this is a book about what's taken away, she seemed to be the one who was always giving. And her acts of generosity were unbelievable to me, and so tenderly written and rendered. I was wondering about the structure of the book and the way that it seems to center female voices, female experiences, and yet beyond the structure of this book, what is this thing that you really wanted readers to walk away with? We have a story of Tibet, we have a story of exile, we have a story of really banishment, of violence and colonialism, and then we have this very human story that's happening. We have stories of love and betrayal in there. What was that thing that you thought, this is the question I'm asking throughout this book with these characters? I was curious about that.
So I don't think I had a conscious question as I was writing, but as I look back on what I've done, I think one of my central concerns is about how people's fates are shaped, I guess, and how big of a role history has in that. I think living in the US for the last 10 years, and right now living in Canada, we live in this, I guess, cult of individualism and also of meritocracy. We really believe in our fates being determined by ourselves and our responsibility to work hard and achieve the things we want to achieve. And if we don't, then it's kind of on us as well. And I think that's a deeply unempathetic, but also like really privileged and flawed way of looking at the world. I don't think it's actually even accurate. And so, for instance, with Tenki, you know, I see now that her experience in relation to Doma's experience, who's also seen as the brilliant one and has just a little bit more privilege and can go a little bit further. To me, that's my way of reckoning with my own privilege, I guess, and seeing, you know, that this is deeply unjust, how some people don't get a chance to realize their full potential, to achieve what they're capable of. But then I think also Lama has a different metric. She's not bought into the same worldview that, you know, Tenki tries to buy into, and Doma by the end of the book is very skeptical of, you know, this sort of dominant idea of success and achievement. These are things that my characters all have different relationships with. Some of them have a chance at it, and some of them never buy into. They're in a different world. So I think Lamo is different in that sense because she comes from a different idea of what's important. For her, it's about taking care of family, and it's about her relationship with her mother and her sister and trying to keep together something that the world seems to want to tear apart.
Relationships are so central to this, and in all the different layered and complicated ways. Mother-daughter, between lovers, between sisters, you know, between Tibetans and maybe non-Tibetans and Westerners. It's really beautifully woven throughout the book. One of the things that struck me here, I have so many things, but one of them is the way that you render the physical realities of exile and displacement. There were moments in here when I could feel the hunger, I could feel the deprivations, feel the cold. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that. It felt like a very conscious decision to make us aware of what these characters were experiencing.
It's funny that you brought up that moment where I showed you that photo, because I think that's what I was trying to do that. And honestly, I feel like I had a lot of personal resistance to do that work, to really enter into that experience, because it's connected to my family and sort things like that. But as I, you know, in the book, I'm trying to conjure an experience. I'm trying to immerse readers into an entire world, and including for Tibetans from my generation who didn't experience this historical moment. And so I had to be willing to experience this myself, at least in my mind. And so that became actually really central to the book itself, because it's about the body. It's about how all of this stuff is actually experienced by human beings, ordinary people, and it's not a theoretical issue. I think the issue of colonization, displacement, exile, these are terms that can feel very abstract. Decolonization as a concept is thrown around everywhere. You know, the IMF, you know, my job at Greenpeace, academia, everybody talks about decolonizing as a metaphor. And I get that, and I understand why this is important to talk about it in all kinds of ways, including in culture. But colonization is about land. It's about human beings. It's about struggle that is deeply felt in the body, and leads to like death, and leads to like physical deprivation. And beyond that, in the story, I really talk about how land is seen in a very different way within the Tibetan worldview. Tibetans, believe that the land is holy, that it is inhabited by gods and spirits. And this is a belief that predated the current belief system of Buddhism. It's ancient shamanic beliefs, So when people are forced to leave that land or cannot even move freely within Tibet, if they're in Tibet right now, which is a kind of internal exile, there is a spiritual violence and dispossession from the land that cannot be understood merely understood through the frameworks of nation states and political science and international relations. This is about the spirit, and things that we believe that maybe don't even have a place in the wider world, and perhaps should. And so that's what I'm trying to bring the reader closer to, both the physical deprivations, but also how beautiful and how deep and rich this belief system is, that is rooted in the body and in the land. And
I think that thinking and the care that you've taken with developing that rootedness to land and the spirituality is something that really comes through in the end. I am not giving the end away when I say it is probably one of the most transcendent endings I have ever read.
Thank you.
It was beautiful, and in a novel that feels so deeply grounded in also the concrete realities of displacement. You have managed to put an emphasis on spirituality and on religion. And I wondered as I was reading this about all of the Western concepts that we have of Tibetan culture, which seems to center around a kind of, I don't know, hazy form of spirituality. I wondered let's talk about this Western concept of Tibetan culture and what it is that your book is doing to push against that.
Yeah, so this is a very long and interesting topic we could talk for a while about. But yeah, there's been centuries-long interest in Tibet in the West, and also in the East. And a lot of that has to do with a sort of very simplistic notion of Tibetan spirituality, Tibet being a land of beauty, but also this very mysterious belief system that has magic and all of this stuff wrapped up in it. And there have been narratives written by people who have never stepped foot in Tibet. And in fact, there's a long tradition of people writing about Tibet who don't know anything about Tibet. So, and right now that we see that in China, there are series written about Tibet in which Tibetan people are rescued by Chinese heroes. And whether it's a positive vision of Tibetans as peaceful, like I guess essentially innately peaceful people, or whether it's the flip side of that is we're seen as simple barbarians, people that need to be civilized. They're just, it's the same thing really. It's just different faces of the same dehumanizing narrative that's been in play for centuries. And of course, like with Orientalism and anything else, it's self-serving to the empire. It's self-serving to the power. It really says more about them and their interests, and it's more a reflection of what they're seeking than it is of anything that Tibetans hold. I wanted to speak to some of the beautiful and mysterious aspects of Tibetan culture, but subvert them at the same time. So I'm not here to present a book of Tibetans who are just pure and good and just victims. My characters are culpable for wrongs as well. They're involved in the theft and trade of Tibetan antiques. They're just as capable of, noble and not noble actions as anybody else. And I think that's really important. So I wanted to pull on readers' interests, things that they might have curiosity about, and then subvert them pretty quickly. And that's really the dual action that I'm trying to achieve here. With the West and with China, Tibetans have often been the ones who have the least voice or the least heard, and certainly the least power. In a ladder of power. Tibetans are at the bottom, in terms of determining policy, in terms of shaping, how things are talked about Tibet. Even Tibetans don't have the power, and I think our cause hasn't been taken seriously in the way it should be. I think it's an overlooked occupation, and we've been fighting alone. And that happens because of erasure and silencing in all spaces, including in literature.
What do you think it means, Tsering, that your book has come out? What do you think it means to the Tibetan community, whether it's abroad or does it make a difference in Tibet?
So far, I've had a lot of positive. I feel like my community has really embraced the book. I feel very grateful for that. It's not something I expected. It's not something I counted on. I was like, oh, I'm talking about, alcoholism and mental illness and all kinds of stuff in here. But I think people are hungry for stories about, experiences that reflect them. What it means more broadly, I think it has more to do with Western publishing, hopefully having a tiny bit more interest and willingness to publish these kinds of stories, because Tibetans have been writing in Tibet and in exile, and most Tibetan writers live and work in obscurity. And I've had a ton of privilege, institutional and cultural privilege, economic privilege, to be able to reach this point. And so what I really hope is that there can be many, many more books that come after this. And, I'm not the first, and I certainly won't be the last to write a book for my community.
Speaking of stories that reflect you, I wondered what it was like to research in the archives for the book. How difficult was it? Did you make some surprise discoveries? What was that like?
It was interesting. So I took a lot of Tibetan studies courses at UBC in my undergrad and also at Columbia. And in my early experience when I was an undergrad, I felt often talked down to by Tibet scholars, not all of them, but even in the texts, there was a way in which our history was described, our people were described, that felt very alien to me, and that felt like they were really talking to each other. This was not about us. I do think that things have changed, and they're slowly changing with, I think the broader conversation around decolonizing academia, but also more Tibetan scholars like knocking down the doors and forcing themselves into these spaces. And so I found a lot of interesting texts that didn't exist 20 years ago when I was an undergrad. There were texts written by Tibetan Buddhist leaders, white scholars, Chinese scholars. So it's really a lovely constellation of all kinds of people doing scholarship that's really valuable. At the same time, I think it's really important to continue the critique because academia is a space of immense power in shaping discourse. And especially when, Tibetans live in one of the most oppressed places in the world, often number 2 after North Korea, according to the Freedom House. So when Tibetans have so little access to the discourse and shaping that, it's really important that anybody who is involved in Tibet studies has a real deep understanding of the colonial project that China is embedded in, and also how they use academia for that as well.
I'm curious about the choices, the artistic choices that you made in writing this book, in terms of not just structure, yes, the form of the book. You're doing this in different voices and doing different years, going back and forth. But language also, syntax. The language is beautiful. And I was really curious reading it about some of your writerly choices here in terms of that.
Oh, so it's really hard to talk about my own language choices, I guess, or artistic choices, but I did a lot of weird things, so with Tenki's section, I spent a lot of time listening to a section of Ulysses, Molly Bloom's perspective. I just listened to it as I wrote, just to add something unexpected. I was looking for different patterns of thought and expression than my own, to change the language fundamentally from the other characters. There were some characters that I just listened to the same album over and over again. Bach was really important to me, Mozart a few years before that. So I had a lot of obsessive listening activity, I guess. So the music or the rhythms of other people's work could somehow seep into my work. Beyond that, it was just a lot of combing over, and I rewrote Tenki's section in so many different voices and structures until I felt like I found something that could work.
That's wonderful. We've talked a bit about the women in the book, but maybe you want to talk about Samphel and some of the other characters in here.
Yeah. So Samphel is the only male perspective in my book. And I really wanted to write about him. I have another male character, Tashi, who's another love interest. And then I have the uncle as well, who takes care of the daughters. But Samphel is interesting because he's kind of a outsider. He might be seen as a bad person within, his community for what he does in terms of antiques trade. And the British, the Chinese have stolen Tibetan goods and spread them around the world, but also Tibetans have. So I didn't want to create just this like black and white situation. At the same time, I wanted to have a lot of sympathy for Samphel because this is a orphan who became a monk, who had nothing, and he had to survive. And this is an important part of the story of many, many stateless people. When the whole world kind of abandons you, what are you going to do to survive? And Samphal's section I wrote pretty fast, actually. It was the fastest section to write because I really enjoyed writing it. I enjoyed writing somebody who's kind of like doesn't care what anybody else thinks. He's like, who are you to basically question what I do? And I still think he tries to do the right thing still, I have a lot of sympathy for him. And he has a moment where he was able to have his meaning, for his life come through as well at the end.
Yeah. I don't know how many people have asked you this already, but I'm curious about what's next for you now. I know this is still early on in the launch of this book, but yeah, have you thought about that?
I have. I've been thinking about this next project for about a year. So fairly early on in my book, there's a section where the mother oracle is at the border and doesn't want to do premonitions anymore. You know, her husband has died and she's, you know, leaving the land where the gods that speak through her live. And so she's, you know, depressed, you know, and lost. And one of the old men who in her village says, how can you refuse to help us? You can fly across the sky. You can ride on the backs of tigers and something like that. And I want to write the next book in a world in which all of that is true.
Oh, wow.
Where all the things that we believed before colonization are real. And so what I've been doing is, in Tibetan tradition, there's image meditation, where you look at a painting of a deity and really meditate on all of the details of that deity, the positioning of their hands, what they're wearing, their jewelry, their face, all of these things you do to recognize the same qualities that are innate inside of you. It's a way of seeing your own qualities, your goodness. And I've been doing image meditation of these magical creatures in Tibetan art, not so much to realize some spiritual, you know, lesson, but to see the human qualities of each of these magical creatures in Tibetan paintings, which are very, very interesting. And even deities, to really look closely at their faces and say, who is this? What do they want? So I've been writing these character studies, and I want to write a novel in which all of these beings exist in a time outside of time, in a place outside of place. And of course, it'll have all the same things I'm interested in right now, which is empire and war and colonization and different worldviews clashing. And so that is the next project. I've been doing research for it, reading a lot about ancient cultures in the Silk Route. And really, I don't want it to be just stuck on Tibet or even on a historical moment, but I want to sort of recognize the beauty and the wisdom of ancient cultures and draw from all of them.
Oh, that's lovely, Tsering. That's really lovely. I know I'm not the only one who cannot wait for this one. It's interesting that I hear in the way that you're describing this, an echo of some of the ideas that were rippling through this novel to up to the very, very end. And so it's really exciting to know that you're going to be continuing that. I think now we can open this up for questions. We are just about there. And thank you so much, Tsering, if I don't get a chance to say that. It's been really great talking to you.
Thank you, Tsering and
Maaza. Thank you so much.
That was a fabulous presentation. Thank you, ladies, so much. So we do have a few questions from the audience. So before we wrap up, I will go ahead and ask you those. So the first one here is, which of the characters do you relate to most and why?
I think I relate to Tenki the most. Because I think she's a bit mischievous and she has an inner world that people don't know about. And I think I guess maybe that's what I want to relate to as a writer. She has a secret world in her mind. And I also relate to her because I feel a lot of sympathy for her, because she has so much hope and so much promise, and she almost has the most difficult story as a result. Yeah.
Okay, so a follow-up for Tenki. So someone said that Tenki, despite being brilliant, had to also deal with the heavy weight of expectation from her camp people. It almost seems to go against the idea of seeing educational opportunity as immediately leading to a better life for the individual. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, I think, again, education being seen as the be all and end all, or sort of that silver bullet, is also a part of this American mythos that erases all the other dynamics at play in somebody's life. We think, oh, if we just learn about this specific struggle, then we'll all be better to each other. We'll all take care of each other. And I'm not convinced by that. I think there are real material changes that need to happen, that have to do with class, that have to do with, I mean, the day-to-day existence of people cannot just be solved by better understanding our situation. This is me speaking as an activist, as an advocate. I believe in organizing. I believe in leveraging power. I believe in connecting and not being atomized in our individual worlds, but coming together. And so that's the next step beyond education. So Tenki could be educated and be brilliant, but come to Canada and live in a racist society which doesn't recognize her brilliance. So that's beyond her individual responsibility to be educated.
Thank you. So the next question was, can you talk about the title? What does it mean in the context of the novel?
Sure. So this comes from a section in Doma's chapter. Basically, it references the act of pilgrimage through prostration. So prostrations are an ancient tradition in lots of different cultures, Islamic culture, Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism. And in Tibetan Buddhism, we have a practice of prostrating on the ground and then rising and then prostrating again and traveling very slowly in this way across great distances, sometimes across all of Tibet, sometimes just around a holy mountain or a holy lake. And people do it every day in front of their altars in the mornings and at night. And basically, it has to do with showing reverence for the land, showing reverence for something greater than you. And I feel like it's quite a beautiful idea when it comes to showing reverence for a country or for a land that we are now cut off from. And Tibetans cannot go on pilgrimage very easily in Tibet. And certainly if you're outside of Tibet, you can't, it's very hard to get into Tibet. And so instead we travel across the world seeking refuge and safety, like 70 million other displaced people in the world. And I find that to be another form of prayer.
Thank you. So were there moments you had to cut while writing the story that you wish could have been kept in?
There's a lot that had to be cut. I wrote and erased the entire draft and started over. And some characters were also cut. I think it was all the right decision. My editors, Grace and Anita, had incredible advice, very gently placed, but ultimately correct. I will say that one character, Gyaltsen La, who is a former minister in the government, he had his own section years ago. And I really love him because to me, he's kind of like a Pinin character, like this kind of lovable, egotistical man. And I might write something like that again in the future because I had a lot of fun with him, but it didn't really belong in the book because the book is centered around a family.
Very interesting. So Maureen said, "This is a great conversation, thank you." And then she also asked, how do you make space for each theme, especially when juggling multiple subjects at once within a novel?
I think it just has to make sense for the characters. I approach it on the level of craft. So there were times when I really went off, like in Doma's perspective, I had pages and pages talking about Buddhist metaphysics. And it was just me, like, honestly, probably showing off or just enjoying the things that I'd learned and just writing it down. And pretty much none of it survived, maybe a page. It just didn't make sense for the story. So the story comes above everything else in my mind. It has to make sense for the characters. And then the other stuff, I can save it for an essay or something, or just enjoy that I learned it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. So that was the last of our questions. Do you have any final words before I wrap up this conversation?
No.
Yeah, I hope everyone reads this book. I think it's backwards on my screen.
No
but,
way, actually.
It's actually really, okay, I see it backwards. But it is absolutely beautiful, and I hope that people read it and talk about it. This is a book about history and politics, but it's a human story, and it's a story that feels very urgent and really current now. We're existing in a world where the conversations are about migration and refugees, but often refugees and migrants are not being given the opportunity to speak. So Tsering, this book means so much, I think, to the international conversations we're having right now. So I hope people really buy it. And I want to thank you for writing it. Yeah.
Thank you, Maaza. This means so much.
It's great.
So thank you so much, Tsering and Maaza. Thank you to our partner, Harvard Bookstore and Politics in Prose, and to all of you for watching and reading. I hope you will support Tsering, Yangzom, Lama, and independent bookstores by ordering your copy of We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. There is a link below if you want to just directly click that. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.